Hello, now it's working. Let's see if you're working.
Hi everyone, welcome back. Hi. Hi. So, it's been an incredible afternoon. Thank you for your attendance and for sticking with us. In this final gathering, we have Shannon Steen, the dramaturge for the play, who is also an associate professor in the Department of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies and in the program in American Studies here at UC Berkeley, whose research herself has focused on intersections of Asian identity and African American identity in early 20th century popular performance. But she is here also wearing her dramaturge hat to help us think about the process of crafting the play. Next to her, Peter Glazer, who is known both in the Bay Area and throughout the United States as an adapter and director with a particular focus on adaptation of folk material and folk songs for the stage, an award-winning playwright and director, who also happens to be the new, recently anointed department chair of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies, and he just decided that he wouldn't have enough to do in that role, and so decided that he would take on the non-professional premiere of a brand new play here in his first year. He served as the director of I Dream of Changanang. And last but not least, the man himself who's brought us all together, Philip Kan Gotanda, who, as you all know, is an award-winning playwright, one of the most important living playwrights working in the United States, whose plays regularly appear on all of our syllabi, whether we're teaching issues of ethnicity in theater, whether we're teaching the history of Asian American literature, or whether we're teaching the history of theater in the United States. He is there as a figure, and we're very privileged to have had the chance to get to work with him for these 18 months, 2.5 years, intense 6 months, depending on when you start counting. So a number of really wonderful, robust, difficult issues have come up throughout the symposium today, and I think this is our chance to hear a bit more about how some of those issues inflected the process of crafting the play. And also, I think in particular, something we'd like to emphasize, the role of the university in offering a kind of laboratory for artists and students to work together on challenging, important material, to take risks artistically, to take risks intellectually in, I use that word laboratory quite significantly. It seems important for the university to function in that role for artists, and we were privileged to work through that kind of a model in this project. So perhaps to start things off, I've introduced you all, so I think I might go pretty much jump right in to hear your responses to some of the things that we've heard about today, about what it meant to work with this historical material, both asking historical material that is volatile and challenging and has ethics and a politics, as has been brought up, and at the same time has a great deal of complexity, as Sam Otter was reminding us in the last panel, that there are no villains and heroes here. There's no good guys and bad guys. There's a very complex history here. And I wonder about your relationship to that material and how it transformed, how you felt enabled by it, what some of the difficult moments might have been in working through it. You want to?
I feel like, having given many papers, you get to see my paper tonight on stage. But I was struck by Eric's image of the posed death cast as a choice by whoever did that to represent Changanang in a particular way. There are many challenges that this play presented. I thought you'd be interested in seeing our poster for the play, which chose to place Changanang shadowed by the two wives, in part because I think that relationship is one of the ones, as some of the people mentioned in the panels, has been such a site of fascination. One of the things about theater is that you are forced to make choices. So all the way through the process, who do we cast, and what are the implications of those choices, given the nature of the population on this campus? When Philip is anticipating the move to the Barnum's American Museum, he writes the following stage direction: instead of stagehands, freaks sweep the stage. How do we represent those freaks? We have to make a choice, costumes, etc. And those are charged choices, absolutely. We are also creating a theatrical event, so we think about the way that those choices fit into the theatrical event. And then we had choices about, we had a long discussion about what to do with the scenes in Siam. Should they speak Siamese, which would sacrifice potential clarity for authenticity or some version of authenticity? Should they speak accented English? That was something that we spent a lot of time working on, and in fact had trained the students in a Siamese accent, working with someone who knew how to do that, and then decided the better choice was to take that away, that was a convention that we wanted to skip. And so that there were many, many opportunities, or many, many moments when this came up. When we get to those freaks, how should they be costumed? How should they be made up, if you will? Since theater is always making things up to a certain extent. And when I think about those representational decisions, I'm drawn back to the question that Alan asked, which is, in what way do I have the authority to tell this story as a director? Philip wrote it, we collaborated closely on a lot of the decisions in the play, but I did always think about, where do I fit into that representational project? Because that's pretty much what a director is responsible for doing, is taking a play and figuring out a way to make it, to do what the play says in a physical sense, right? To bring it to the stage, and Sam referred to that. I don't know whether this is the time you want me to show some pictures or we can wait, but I have, at some point we can show some images from the play, just for those of you who haven't seen it. I have about 8 of them, just to give you a quick sense of the visual world. Let me do that. Let me do that now. Because they will speak to some of the things. Oh my God, the microphone works over here too. They will speak to some of the things that we've been talking about. Andy Chan and Jose Marie Sanz playing Aang and Chang. You'll see the sort of almost bandolier that was used, and you'll see a better picture of it in a moment to connect them. This is during their time in Siam, before their journey to America. This is after they are, where Chang has saved Aang from drowning and has revived him by breathing into him, and breath and air are a thematic in this play. This is, you're here, right here on the stage with the Siamese, with the sign of Siam, the elephant there. This is a scene of their swimming, and if you look closely, you can see the red ligature that connects them. And I can't tell you how long we spent trying to decide how to manifest that, how to represent that. Philip made it very clear that they should be able to separate and rejoin. And how do we make that work? And how do we represent that and give them both freedom and limitation and a sense of not being able to move independently. But Philip says that in the play they must separate, and one of the decisions we had to make was, when does that first happen? And what are the implications of that move? There's actually a quote, just very quickly, from one of the reviews that says, "The actors sometimes float away from one another in their solitary imaginations." And I kind of like that. To give you a sense of the scale of the play, this is on their trip from Bangkok to Boston. can see Changaneng floating in the air and some of the other actors holding the sail. This gets into the question of representational style, what the style of this production is, what the storytelling style is, and in what ways is the set a manifestation of a dream, and how does that dream get represented. This is the first time they're on display in America. Mrs. Coffin says, well, if they're Siamese, they better look Siamese. So she dresses them up in these costumes. And this is their first, the moment before their first appearance before an audience in Boston. And I wanted to show this photograph. There's a very important scene in the play when Philip describes the touching of their ligature by their future wives. And I thought long and hard, and we all thought long and hard about how to represent that, because they talk about how it feels like a baby's flesh. And I just decided, and we decided that their real flesh should be a representation of the ligature in that one moment, instead of a piece of elastic or rubber or nylon that was actually what we used to connect them. That's one of their future wives. And then finally, I'm just very fond of this photograph because it demonstrates in a way the fact that the period was so important in this play. This is Changaneng in their performance outfits, surrounded by their wives, late in the play. There are 130 costumes in the play. Philip writes a stage direction. They change clothes. He wrote that stage direction many times. So, but this is quite a beautiful photograph of the women playing their wives and Changaneng. So I'll end it there, but I just thought you would enjoy seeing a few images, and maybe we'll let that one sit on the screen for a bit.
I think one of the things that we might think about in terms of the history of this play, or the history that this play refers to, is to ask a question about why we stage historical source material and what it means to use historical source material as the inspiration for an artistic experiment. And typically when we talk about the uses of history, we usually think about that Santayana sentiment about how those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. And so we think about going back to archival sources or things like that as important so that we don't repeat the mistakes of our predecessors. But it seems to me that this play actually does something slightly different that might be useful for us. I had a student at one point who asked me whether or not we could really think about this play as an Asian American play, given that Changaneng have such an exceptionalist history, right? That they are conjoined, that they are one of the very few examples of people who are exhibited as freaks, but who have control over their own displays so that they're not exploited in the same way that other people are in this period, and who moreover are in the United States earlier than the large waves of immigration that come from Asia later in the century, and who are excluded from all kinds of citizenship rights as the century wears on. And it seems to me that one of the things that's interesting about the story of Changaneng is precisely the fact that they exist in a different relationship to American citizenship than the people who come to the United States after them. That they give us a way of thinking about what it means to be Asian American, or to be Asians in America, or to be what it means to be Chinese, which is a question that Changaneng ask each other in the course of the play, that we don't normally talk about when we talk about the histories of Asian Americans. So that's one thing that I think is useful about the play and that is interesting about thinking about what history can and can't do for us on the stage. The other is thinking about the kinds of elements that fall out of the historical record and how we can use the theatrical world or the creative world to redress some of those absences. So for example, I was really struck this afternoon in Cynthia Wu's piece about how the bunker descendants think about kinship and their relationships to one another, that they all think about their relationships to one another through Changaneng. And they don't think about their relationships to one another through the maternal line, right? They don't talk about the Yates sisters who were married to Changaneng, or at least that wasn't a feature of the paper today. And one of the striking elements of the play is the extent to which the Yates sisters occupy a pretty significant portion of the psychic life of the play and the psychic life of the characters of Changana and Eng. So we might also think about, I think the play gives us a way to think about multiple kinship delineations and all kinds of things that maybe aren't in the historical record or even in the the oral history record around these two figures. So those, I think, are really interesting elements of the play.
I'll talk about something totally different. I just thought I'd give a little background on where the play came from. I've been trying to write this piece for, I was told, it was clarified to me, I thought it was like 20 years or so, but it's 27 years. It was originally a commission that was part from Berkeley Rep. And at the time, I tried and couldn't write the piece, so I ended up writing another piece and submitting that to the commission. But when I first encountered this topic, I did a great deal of research. I interviewed. I had so many different things I wanted to say. There were so many points of entry, so many interesting aspects to it in terms of its layering as far as personal, public, social, national. All aspects of that were so intriguing to me. And what I found is I couldn't write it. You know, I just had so much stuff in my head that I wanted to put down. I couldn't write it. And I would go back to it every couple of years. And about 5 years ago, I just got all my boxes of research and just put them away and thought that's it, you know, because too much time has passed. I'm not going to go back to this. And then I was doing a piece here that I was co-directing called The Fist of Roses. I'm not too sure why, but something about the environment being around students and around this particular department allowed me to just begin to write. And I decided when it happened that I wasn't going to pay attention to anything that I had thought about or researched or whatever. I was just going to let it go. Just whatever came out, came out. And so, oddly enough, I was able to come up with the first draft. And that is sort of the history or sort of the origins of the piece. I just wanted to talk a little bit about when Peter and the department approached me about, you know, doing a piece with them. I had two things in mind. The first is Changning is a very big piece. It's got a lot of characters, a lot of costumes, period piece, the nature of the material, themes. It's not the easiest play to work on at a regional theater. This is a new play, so many characters. Regional theaters, by and large, just don't have the capacity anymore to work on a play this big. And when I talked to Peter, I realized this was a wonderful opportunity for me, you know, to work on the play in an environment that could accommodate that wanted to accommodate that. They wanted to have more, you know, more characters, more actors involved. Normally, when you work at any other regional theater, it's 2 is great, you know, 3 is okay, and then beyond that, it gets a little dicey. As opposed to here, you know, many characters was good. So for me, this was a really good opportunity. I thought it was a good marriage where there was a department, you know, this particular department that was interested in my work and willing to support it, and I was able to work on a piece of material which I wouldn't have had the opportunity anywhere else. That's simply a, you know, fact of the matter in quite the same way. The other thing was that in all my times working in regional theater, I'm around smart people all the time. But one of the things that you don't have access to and you aren't around is I keep using the same terms, but an intellectual rigor, an opportunity to be around people who are, you know, the top thinkers in their particular fields. And what this particular environment offered me was a chance to work on a piece which dealt with a lot of very particular themes and issues, and at the same time to have access to specialists, you know, go to them to help inform the material. And that was another aspect which was important to me. I wanted to try that. And it really, in the end, it worked out extremely well. It really affected and informed the piece in so many different ways. And then the last thing is just the idea of, and I hadn't expected it, but working with students. I hadn't worked on a new play with students before, and I hadn't worked much with students at all. And I love the experience. You know, it's hard to kind of describe, but the idea of working with students and them working with us was an experience I hadn't quite thought of as being the point of me doing this as far as a new play. The play was everything. But in fact, that sort of changed along the way. And in my discussions with Peter, you know, there was a point where just before we opened, I wanted to do some big changes to the piece. And normally I would say, you know, we're going to do this. And the director would go, okay, we're going to do it. And you just give it to the actors, and that's that. But it also, this particular decision entailed, you know, eliminating some large scenes and taking scenes away and acting moments from some of the actors, some of the students. And you know, Peter took me aside and basically said, you know, like, we have to consider this. This isn't necessarily a professional production. It's the students. And this is an opportunity to act, to perform, to be a part of this. And when you make a decision like this, you know, it's different than in the professional field where you just do it without a thought as to the actor necessarily, the consequences, how they might feel, or what they're getting out of the experience. And Peter impressed upon me, and I got it. This wasn't about just the play. This wasn't about, you know, just getting the best work. It was also about working with students, and it being a teaching moment as well as a learning moment both ways. And so that was one of the things that I got from this experience that was unexpected and quite nice.
Thank you, Philip. I wonder, since Philip has segued with that lovely story, which you know, certainly I think warms the hearts of some of us up here. If Peter or Shannon, you have some thoughts about this particular type of process that Philip is describing, maybe to move into what it means in terms of the university collaboration with, say, a Bay Area artist, or what the role of a theatrical process is for you in terms of our mission here at the university.
Now I've been here 9 years, so I've directed many plays with students. It's the first time we've ever done a brand new play with a nationally known celebrated playwright and a premiere. I think that and Philip has said this on occasion, and I have sort of a couple of thoughts, that not only is there the practical, you know, we get to do big plays here at Berkeley because we want students to have as many opportunities as possible. But one of the most wonderful things about working with students is that they will go anywhere. They will take chances. They will travel great journeys because of the nature of this being an educational institution. And I think that that the journey that this play has taken from the first workshop in the fall until tonight and this past weekend is really remarkable. And that and what Philip has often said is this model of a playwright developing a work within the context of a department such as ours is a model that he thinks is something that really needs to be explored further in American theater because of the opportunities it affords the playwright and because of the opportunities it affords the students. If you think about Shannon talking about the histories, right? Each one of these students with the exception of Changane, I think, and one other character in the play multiple roles, historical roles from different periods. And each one of those students needed to understand the period within which they were playing that part. They had so many questions for the dramaturgs. And doing this play is taking a history class, right? And in the least didactic sense, because the students are committed to emotionally investing in certain characters from different times and places. And in order to do that, they're just like desperate to suck up information that can inform those choices. So the model, as we've tried to explore it, I think has huge benefits, both for the writer and for the students, in that the students will go just about anywhere. And Philip, I mean, we rewrote throughout the entire process. We rewrote, we cut maybe 5 pages for the final dress rehearsal. It was only on opening night that I made my little statement to Philip about, I don't know if we want to do that tonight yet, quite make that change. But we were changing throughout the process, and the students really embraced that. I think they understood that this was a really exciting moment for them because they were doing a new play that had never been done before in front of an audience. And that was, so I'm really excited by Philip's interest in this model. And I think that it's something that we've benefited from. And it goes without saying, and Philip says this was a practical, to some extent, a practical decision on his part. The fact that he gave us this play to explore is remarkable and marvelous, and we are in such debt to him for doing that. And our students have gotten such of a benefit from that. And Philip, I believe, has learned a huge amount about this play, that this environment afforded him the opportunity to learn. So that's a few thoughts.
I think in addition to those things, there are some other reasons why it's useful to think about universities as incubators for new work. And one of them is that in addition to the challenges that now face regional theaters in terms of just pure money that's available to pay actors or to build the 130 costumes that are in this show, which is an extraordinary number, and which when I tell my friends who run professional costume shops in the Bay Area, a friend of mine, for example, who runs the San Francisco Opera costume shop, she was blown away by the fact that we were doing 130 costumes for this show. That's very unusual in a professional production these days. So in addition to being able to work around some of the financial constraints on new work that's in the professional theater in that sense, universities are also not as beholden to the box office in the way that professional theaters are. Those pressures are not non-existent for us. They're still around a little bit for us, but not in quite the same way. So it does mean that universities can be places for experimentation in a way that professional theaters can't be. It also seems to me that there's something particularly important about Berkeley or another UC school being an incubator for this kind of work, which is about the kind of regionalization of certain kinds of topics in American theater. Philip has mentioned to me before that sometimes he's frustrated by the fact that, say, in New York, that the New York theater scene tends to be less interested in, say, Asian American stories or stories that are about, say, Asian American things that happen in California because it's not a New York story, right? Or it's not an East Coast story. And so there's a way in which, because so much of theatrical production in the United States is dictated by what happens in New York first, that there are a lot of stories about the United States that are left untold because they're not interesting to people in Manhattan. So if we want stories about California to be told, and I think that there are some really excellent reasons for why stories about California should be mainstreamed inside of American history, that it feels like universities like Berkeley have a particularly important role to play in broadening the kinds of regional histories that are made symbolic of the United States as a whole.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we'll open it up to questions from the audience if you have things for our playwrights or dramaturge. Yes. I'm sorry, I can't see very well. Okay, yeah.
We can see all the lights.
Caitlin.
Yeah.
It was actually from a review.
Oh, from a review.
Yeah,
Float
that
away in their
just
solitary-
observed.
Oh, okay. In their solitary imaginations. And I'm very new to disability studies, very, very new. So this question is really interesting to me in terms of what that decision says about, it's going to be very hard for me to articulate this, what it says about the relationship of the body to mind, first of all, the body to imagination, and to individuality of these figures. Because I guess, and it's going to be kind of very careful about big, long, strong question, but I think this might clarify, which is the choice to be as historically accurate as possible, say around costuming, and yet to allow this deeply fantastical moment of allowing them to separate. I'm really curious about that choice.
Well, it's written into the script, so,
Okay.
I mean,
came
that's
from-
my excuse.
Which came from?
Philip said from the very beginning that he didn't want them conjoined through the entire play. And he can speak to this himself, but he said because they thought of themselves as individuals, and he wanted to give them the opportunity to be individuals in a physical sense. So he didn't specify that many times where this would happen, a couple of times, but he made it very clear that he did not want them physically conjoined for the entire play. And I think that a number of people have commented on the fact that it's I dream of Changaning. And this is not a cop-out. It's to say that first of all, that was a very hard choice to actually enact on stage, to have that disconnection and that connection happen, just the technology of it. How do we do that? Does it look silly? Does it look technological? Does it look real? Does it look powerful theatrically, which is our goal? But as we worked on the play, there were certain scenes where we thought, well, let's try it here. And we would look at the scene and work on it for a while and then think, maybe that's not the right scene for it. And then we would try it another place and we'd go, oh my God, that's so powerful to have them suddenly separate. So there is an authenticity in the costuming, absolutely. It's a period piece. But there is also, in this play, a great deal of fantasy. I won't let you in on it all because you're going to see it tonight, but the play does not live in an entirely naturalistic world, which I think allows us the possibility of giving them that freedom, and then the implications of that freedom, I think, are what become very complicated in what they say.
I too, there's also, in addition to the fantastical elements of the play, there's also a really important thematic question that the play asks relative to the subjectivity of people who are conjoined, right? Which is, to what extent are conjoined twins, are their psyches formulated through a sense of unity, and to what extent do they have individual psyches, right? And that's a question that gets explored in the play in various ways, right? There's a moment in which another character tells one of the twins a secret and says, this is now this thing that you have that this other person doesn't have. And this is the first time in the play that we see this person, that we see the twin, one of the twins, having an individual thought that is not shared by the other person. And he even hesitates at first to even let himself be told the secret because he's not sure that he wants to be separated in that way. So the physicalization, or the separation of the two twins is in some ways a physicalization of that question of whether or not there's a kind of unified psyche or whether or not there are these two individual people in there, two individual psyches that are operating in the play.
Just briefly, it came up in the talk about the African American young women because there was the quieter, shyer twin and the other one, the angrier and the feistier, which is exactly, in fact, how Changaning were understood to live in the world and part of the work that we did in trying to identify them as individuals. So I thought it was very interesting that that parallel came up in the talk about another pair of conjoined twins. So.
Another question, yes.
I'm very interested in how the three of you, in terms of process, as theater professionals, were thinking
sort of interesting in terms of how I conceived the characters. I always saw them as both. Again, this is purely in my mind as I was conceiving them. When they're apart, I don't see them being apart. And when they're together, I don't see them. In other words, they're both all the time. And in their separation, when they separate theatrically on stage, I'd like to believe it doesn't feel as if they're separating their bodies. Rather, their bodies are still together, and we're seeing an internal moment of where each of their imaginations travels to a different place. You know, this is the thing of theatricality and how do you present things. One of the things I thought when I thought of the Conjoined twins was that theatrically, you know, I wanted to tell a bigger story, a different kind of story, as opposed to a film. You know, if I were to make a film, they would always be, you know, conjoined. But as I wrote the play, again, as I said, have you seen the play yet? No. Okay. Not that it will solve anything, but again, as I felt the play and as I wrote it, and I had those moments where I thought they're going to be apart. Again, I didn't feel as if they were bodily apart, but rather, again, they were exploring their sort of individual imaginations, and I hope you'll see it. And I'm wondering if I'm hopeful that will be conveyed, that it's never about them wanting to be apart, but rather there are moments when they are thinking individually in relationship to issues and their internal life. So,
And one thing I'll add to that is that that somehow I think is important in thinking about the play as a whole is that there are many scenes that we stage where it's interesting that we constantly in rehearsal use the word conjoined when we're talking about two young men who are connected by a piece of fabric. But when we see the struggle of that connection, there's a scene towards the end of their lives, they began to dislike each other intensely, and they fought. They fought so bitterly that they would have to be, and I know the term is charged, separated by the police to prevent themselves from killing each other. And there is a very bloody fight at the end of the play when they try to kill each other, effectively, when they beat each other up. And they are conjoined at that moment. There's a scene at the beginning of the play when they're thrown into the water before we ever see them separate, and they're drowning, and they try to save themselves. So I think what I'm getting at is that those images are very powerful, and the limitations that they struggled with their entire lives are very much a part of those scenes, so that by the time they make that first step away from each other, I think we have come to understand what they had to struggle with. But the other thing that Philip has done, and I think it's interesting when you think about looking at the play, is that one of his lines is, "Heaven wants us together more than apart." And that was, I think, how they came to terms with their disability, in that they believed that there was some reason that they were that way, and they found a way to come to terms with it. So you take that and you set it against the limitations that we see them struggling with and fighting with. Their father tries to kill them because he doesn't want them to infect the rest of the village with their, effectively with their freakishness. So it's a really powerful and important question, and the play, I think, is hopefully at least exploring that question and not evading that question. So.
Yes. Yes, hi. I'm sitting here and in my English class on literary literature, we were asked, you know, to make a choice to come to the play, which I did. And we had the opportunity to have the script to read. And in
What was the end?
How many ewes? How many ewes?
Oh, but that's not fair unless we have the document in front of us and we can do a word count search.
I'm asking because I, as a, disability study minor, I wanted to have a different perspective on the play, not coming from the, what we call the med or social construct, but rather coming from them. How do they see themselves instead of how, because I'm going to say something really powerful, but to me, disability is only constructed. So I wanted to see how much of or you can imagine yourself as a different person you put into the play. Do you understand the question?
Almost.
I think one of the things to think about with this may be clear. Have you seen it yet?
I have.
You have? Okay. So I think that partly because of the choice to allow them to do things like separate on the stage and things like that, that in some ways points to the constructedness of ideas of disability, right? There are also some pretty major issues about parts of their own personal history and biography that support exactly what it is that you're saying. So one of the things that's extraordinary about them, in addition to the extent to which they were really their own agents, and that they were their own operators, and that they really controlled the circumstances of their exhibition in ways that almost no one else did in this period who would have been exhibited for similar reasons. Then in addition to that, they also had this whole incredibly intense physical life that was part of the promotional materials for the show. So you'll see this for those of you who haven't seen it yet, there's a backdrop that falls at one point in the play that's based on promotional materials that shows them doing things like chopping down trees together at the same time and rowing boats together at the same time and shooting things that they're hunting together at the same time, right? Like activities that that are part of an interface with the physical world that we normally assume is excluded to people who are disabled, right, or who are physically disabled. And they were really vigorous, they were really aggressive about not only just doing those things and participating in those activities, but in making that part of the marketing materials for their display. And I think that part of maybe what motivated them to do that may have been a very similar impulse to the one that you're thinking about the way that disability is constructed. So that's one way to think about it. I want to take this moment actually to thank my assistant dramaturge, Josh Williams, who's a really amazing graduate student of ours who did a stunning job doing this work. He was actually the person who found that. He was the person who found that image, which is now so central to the play. So I just wanted to make sure I slipped in a shout out to him at some point in this process today.
Keep talking, I'll be with you in a moment.
Another question?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Gosh, sorry.
I want to thank you all, first of all. It's so rare to have an opportunity. I haven't seen the play yet tonight, but to hear the behind the scenes, literally, discussion of it. And some of the things that were going through my mind was the effective live performance as opposed to film. And I'm thinking about how the opportunities opened up by the live performance with the separation and signifying of their connection. Got a little distracted by the just
I'm sorry, I will turn this off if I do now. I'll be there in a second. Keep talking.
Is how that particular physical configuration made that possible. Like, or it could have been possible, like Millie and Christine could do a similar staging. With someone like Abby and Brittany Hensel, you literally would need to have people who had that bodily configuration to play them. Like singleton people, right? Normative people could not signify that on a live stage. It would have to be done in film, visually, and there's a whole like Google image universe of people who made them
repeat a little bit of the questions. I'm not sure. I know Ellen's far away. First of all, there was a lead up to sort of thinking about live performance versus film, some reflections about that. And then also about the particular thing of representing a certain kind of non-normative body that is about conjointedness, and as opposed to the representations of other forms of disability that have a certain kind of cliche, the person who couldn't walk suddenly can, and here we have a different, just sort of different decisions about trying to represent conjointedness, trying to represent separateness.
I just have one. I mean, it's a fascinating question, and Philip may disagree with me. I think that with the exception of what are two very consciously constructed and presented fantasy sequences, that the play would work if they did not separate. That's my first thought. My second thought is that theater is a pretense. We are casting actors who are not conjoined to pretend to be conjoined. So therefore, we are constructing a pretense by having them never able to separate, which would be, if you will, authentic in the sense that they could never ever do that in their real lives. But it may be that by having them have those moments when they separate, we are actually acknowledging the fact that the pretense is real, that the pretense of these two actors being conjoined is something that we can't get around. That we are not, we are not in this case using actors who have a specific disability of that sort, and that it in fact calls attention to the pretense of theater, which for me is often what can make theater the most powerful. When you don't pretend that you're not pretending. That's not meant to be an excuse, it's just an observation about sort of almost the phenomenology of what the theatrical event is. But you'll get to judge for yourselves. I mean, it's a complicated question. There's no doubt about it. And finding that first moment was very difficult. But so I hope that begins to answer your question. I never thought to have them always together because Philip told me they needed to separate. And so there we went, you know.
Well, this has been, for me, again, a very big learning experience. There's so many considerations and questions that I don't know if I considered, quite the way I think I'm beginning to understand. That said, ultimately, what I was trying to write was a love story between two brothers, and that was my driving force. Is that these were two brothers who were in love, and this is a telling of their love story. So when you come see it, you keep that in mind also.
Well, thank you, Philip. Thank you, our panelists. Thank you. And please join us in the lobby for some little libation and something to eat. And I hope those of you who can will join us for the performance tonight.